because research questions are a huge aspect of what they do in their Rec Comp classes, the course that this is a larger part of. So I kind of talk about how, like, if you have an assumption or a bias, it can often come across in your research question, and your research question can sometimes, very often, lead you to only one conclusion if it's coming through that. So, a lot of emphasis on bias language being vague, inaccurate. And I sometimes feel like I'm cushioning the blow a little bit, talking about it in this way rather than in a, again, more explicitly like DEIB centric way, in that, like, it's kind of hard to explain, but it's like, obviously you should care about what you're calling like minoritized populations, and you should care about like how people want to be referred to, and et cetera. And that would be, the most obvious thing here. But I sometimes feel like I'm kind of cushioning the blow somehow by phrasing it more towards this like academic aspect. I don't know if that's really the case. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, but so then we go into the scholarly publishing ecosystem. So I asked them to take a minute and think about how, the library pays money for you to be able to buy or borrow books, articles. We have scholarly info sources. We have current info for you. So I asked them to guess a dollar amount. They usually lowball it. I think like $250 is the lowest anybody has ever guessed, which obviously we all wish our info costs $250 a year. Some of them will guess something much bigger, kind of like as a joke, basically, not expecting it to be right. So I am kind of going for shock value with this, obviously, with like this wind up here. And then this large amount. And it does generally shock them. It doesn't really necessarily occur to them that, something they have kind of been told, like they could really just find through Google, would cost $1.2 million. So, again, going for shock value, and it generally is surprising to them. And then we go into why everything is so expensive and how they can have such a profit margin in the scholarly publishing industry. So this is a wall of text. I do go through it with them, kind of step by step. So, we talk about how it really is an industry. The sales amount to more than $19 billion a year, positioned between music industry and film industry. We do talk about the 5 large publishing houses. I don't expect them to remember the names, but just I mention them because they kind of probably will start to at least recognize them as they use the databases. Control more than 50% of the market. Elsevier is the largest. Profit margin, particularly, profit margin of 40%, higher than Microsoft, Google, and Coca-Cola. So again, going for shock value here. And then we go into why they have such a high profit margin, which is because by and large, most of this work, it really is kind of being done for free. They're getting a lot of free labor. So we talk about the scholarly conversation and how everybody's expected to, write, they're expected to edit, they're expected to peer review, they're expected to whatever, generally for free. We talk about tenure, a little bit simplified definition there. We go into a little bit more specific about it, but not much, because, at its core, tenure is guaranteed permanent employment. And then we talk about how not everybody at a university who is doing all of this free work could actually even attain tenure. And I have, before this lesson, talked to the professor and seen if they're comfortable talking about their experiences with tenure or lack thereof. And this is where I invite them to talk about that. And all of the professors have been happy to do that so far. The core writing team, the Rec Comp professors that control the curriculum, they're actually professors of the practice. So they are not tenure track. And a lot of them are not even full year contract. So they do like having an opportunity to talk to their students about like what that means for them. And again, talking about how, a lot of them talk about like when they first got out of grad school and they were like between jobs and they were expected to keep up on the scholarship in their field, but they didn't have a library to pay for all the info and they were having to pay for articles and things like that. So again, emphasizing like money is like a huge aspect of this. We talk a little bit about open access. This is mostly just to talk about, again, like how they were probably kind of told that like most of what they could do would be through Google. And, I just kind of like emphasize, like, if you ever Googled for a scholarly article and you were able to access it and you didn't have to pay for it, that's because it was probably published open access. And open access is not necessarily better for the professor or the writer or the scholar who is producing that work. They may actually have had to pay to publish that thing. So again, just emphasizing like, it is an industry, and whatever you come up with for disseminating information is actually probably just going to be another avenue for them to make a profit. And I've got a couple of just prompting questions sprinkled throughout. And by and large, they have, actually always, they really understand it. I asked a question and it's clear that they're kind of understanding, like, follow the money trail, and money affects the type of information that's available to everyone. So then we go into academia itself and like our assumptions about diversity within academia. I just asked them to picture the word, what comes to mind when they hear the word scholar or professor. My mental picture personally is always Albert Einstein for some reason. And a lot of them have a very similar picture, like generally older, white, male, kind of stodgy, that kind of thing. I was using Indiana Jones as an example, but we got kind of bogged down into like a lot of the students actually didn't know who Indiana Jones was. So then it got into like, well, I feel old and I have to over explain who Indiana Jones is and why this is like a good example. So I'm going to change that next time. So then we get into the diversity or lack thereof in academia. So we look at this 2021 538 article. I chose this one because it has some nice visualizations. We don't go through the whole article. I do encourage them to go back and look at it. I don't know if anybody actually does, but so the article is universities say they want more diverse faculty. So why is academia still so white? And again, it's got some nice visualizations, which I think are helpful, particularly for this generation, because we are very visual these days. So white faculty are overrepresented any way you cut it. So they have the racial breakdown of the US population first, and orange is white non-Hispanic. So you can see it's, like 50-ish%, 49%. One square representing approximately 1% of the population. Then we've got the US undergrad population. So they can see that is, again, mostly white, but slightly less. And then we've got the visualization of US tenure and tenure track faculty. So obviously overwhelmingly white here. And less than 1% American Indian or Alaska Native. So I really try to emphasize that, like, there isn't even one population that they numbered here that isn't even, worth a square, basically. So, and during this, I do emphasize that, race is not the only diversity that you will encounter or that is important or that you might want to study, but it is one of the ones that is studied the most. So a lot of the information out there is about racial diversity. But I do emphasize there's, also like, physical ability, mental ability, socioeconomic class, religion, obviously sexuality, all kinds of differences in people. So we go through this and then we come back here and we talk a little bit again, according to the IPEDS database, underrepresented minority faculty comprised roughly 11% of tenure track or tenured faculty in 2013, increased to just 12% in 2019. So just a 1% increase over 7 years. And then again, to kind of emphasize, like, race again is not the only diversity to talk about, but same time period, tenure track or tenured faculty who are women increased just 2% over 7 years. So then obviously, again, they get that, you know, if the tenure track and tenured professors who are doing a lot of the research are primarily white or primarily abled or primarily male or whatever, then probably a lot of the research out there is maybe not going to be into minoritized people, or it's going to be coming from a perspective that could not necessarily understand what a minoritized population is going through or has been going through or will go through. So then we go into how to make your research more inclusive. We talk about our own identities first. I had them fill out an identity wheel, a social identity wheel specifically. And I think the social identity wheel is a good reflective tool. I'm not going to have them do that going forward, but it was interesting to just see how willing they were, I guess, to fill it out. I did do this because in their freshman seminar, their first year seminar, this is also an exercise there. So I kind of was just borrowing something that they had probably already done by that point. I was thinking it might be easy because they had already done it. But again, I'm not going to do it continuing forward, and we'll get into that more later. But I do also provide an example wheel. This is my wheel. I like this one particularly because it has a couple of categories that people don't generally think of when it comes to their social identity, or at least, you know, they don't think about it if it is not a huge part of their identity, like first language, national origin. Again, I'm thinking of our pretty white, pretty homogenous student population. They probably don't think about their first language. They probably don't think about their national origin, etc. Age is one that I use to kind of be like an overarching theme for them. So I talk about, you know, how somebody my age might look at them and think, you know, they're not wise, they're not interested in what's going on in the world, they're not whatever, et cetera, et cetera. So I do talk about how like ageism is maybe something that you don't necessarily think of, but could be something that's being applied to you. And I do spend a lot of time on my own physical, emotional, or developmental disability, which is that I do struggle with depression. And unfortunately, anxiety and depression are something that are very relatable for them these days. So then I talk a little bit about how, like, not even academics or librarians specifically are infallible in this. I talk a little bit about subject headings that are, you know, outdated and inaccurate, but theoretically still in the system today. If there are any catalogers in the audience, I'm very sorry. I was summarizing these, and I may have come up with some accidentally misleading summarizations. So if I did, I apologize. I was kind of, again, going for shock value, and I am going to change this list again. This is from the cataloging lab, I think it's just called problematic subject headings glossary, which has actually removed a lot of these too now. But, you know, again, going for shock value, like defloration, like nobody has probably heard that term in a million years. Indian literature, so I actually use this in a demo in a minute. They mean indigenous literature, but, you know, you probably, because you are an intelligent person, you probably thought literature from the country of India. Sexual minorities, primitive art, again, kind of like, you know, they just mean tribal or indigenous art, but it's really primitive has a very derogatory connotation. But, you know, again, just examples of like how even people who are well-versed in this are not perfect, and we're also dealing with what has come before us, basically. So then, like I said, I give a brief demo. This is kind of because I felt weird not giving a database demo in a first year intro writing course, but it is incredibly brief. I usually just go for JSTOR because it kind of looks familiar to them. A lot of them have used it before. And also JSTOR, of course, will come up with a lot because it has a lot in it. So I first searched for Indian literature, which was in that list before. And of course, a lot of articles about literature from the country of India come up. a lot of names that sound Indian, that kind of thing. And then I talk about how, so, okay, like if your research question was actually about Native American literature, but you searched Indian literature, then obviously that is not going to work for you. So if you're using outdated, you know, a little bit biased language, you're being inaccurate. So then I search for Native American literature. And obviously, you know, for this pretend research question, a lot more comes up. No more literature from the country of India. It's now about Native American literature. Then I go a step further and I say, you know, even within more inclusive, more updated, more accurate language, you could generally have an opportunity to be even more accurate, more inclusive, et cetera. So then I search for Cherokee literature. And again, it's much, much, much more specific. So just, again, like illustrating, you know, even within a certain population, you could probably get more specific because, of course, within Native American tribes, there are tribes. So you want to look for your specific tribe. Then we talk about, you know, if you're not sure what kind of terminology to use, you can pretty easily Google for it. We do talk about our Change the Subject initiative, which we're doing at our library. I won't get hugely into that, but basically if they find subject headings that are being applied to our materials and they think they're problematic, they can report those to us and we will either use their suggested replacement term or we'll research what to use instead. We also talk about non-academic sources a little bit, social media, nonprofit organization websites, other websites, Wikipedia. But again, I do emphasize like check out the information, triangulate it, and again, follow the money trail. Like maybe that nonprofit seems like it's giving you good info, but are they giving you good info or are they giving you info that makes you believe something that whoever is sponsoring them wants you to believe? And then a little bit about how it may sometimes be necessary to actually search within with that outdated or maybe even offensive language, particularly when you're trying to find primary sources, just because, again, you're thinking about like the language that was used during the time that you were researching. This was just kind of to head off questions about primary sources, because that is also a big aspect of some of the ENGL 1001 work, but also like a lot of them are maybe taking like an intro history course or an intro classics course or something like that. But I do emphasize, again, a lot of scholars will still use updated or inclusive language in their analysis. So, you know, if you're looking for secondary sources, you can often get good results from that still, from using that updated language. Then I talk about citation in a, I hope, different way than they have heard before. I talk about how it's really important, but it's even more important when you're citing minoritized scholars. Again, I emphasize like how much you publish is very important to like your career. You know, if you're up for a promotion and somebody else is up for a promotion and you're exactly the same, except that that other person has been cited more, that person might get that promotion over you, that kind of thing. And then again, talking about how citation rates for men are on average higher than those for women, and how, of course, white scholars are generally cited at higher rates than people of color in many disciplines. And we talk a little bit about Wikipedia. This is kind of just because, like, I know they're using Wikipedia, and I don't want to necessarily discourage it. I use Wikipedia, but just again, like, triangulate the info, follow the money trail. But Wikipedia users are doing a lot to like perform citational justice, make sure that people get credit for things that they weren't given credit for at the time and things like that. Then we have a final activity, which is where I give them some research prompts. They just blindly pick out a piece of paper with a research prompt on it. And then they are encouraged to look at the question, maybe revise it, think of a way for it to be maybe making less assumptions, being a little less biased, think about different language to use, that kind of thing. And I have some examples here. So these are not taken from research questions that first years have come in with, but they're inspired by research questions that first years have come in with. So, of course, first years, because they're still getting used to writing research questions or thinking about research questions, their research questions tend to be a little like making assumptions, maybe using like language that could be a lot more accurate, that kind of thing. So, again, just kind of vague, maybe a tiny bit biased, maybe pretty biased in some cases. And I also include some examples of ones that seem fine on the surface. So, writing about Native Americans around Fairfield and need to find historical stuff as well as modern. But this one, again, is kind of designed to prompt them into thinking about, okay, well, Native American seems like a pretty inclusive term. That seems like fine. But again, like, who are the Native Americans around Fairfield? What tribes are around Fairfield? I need to find historical stuff as well as modern. So like, how do I differentiate like the language that I use to find those primary sources as well as those modern sources, that kind of thing. So they do this exercise and then we all come back together and talk about it. And they actually really like this exercise. So this is even something that you could do like separately from the inclusive research lesson if you wanted, but they brought this up a lot in their feedback, which I'm going to get into, but they really like this one, particularly, I think, because again, like research questions are really emphasized in this course. So that's the final activity. And students' reactions to the lesson as a whole were mixed, obviously, but also surprising at the same time. So we did happen to be doing an instruction assessment at the time. It was a two-part assessment where after their library session, we asked one question and then we asked another one that was sent to them by the professor after they had done their big research project. This was just to get like, again, like an idea of what they thought was important right after the session, and then what they thought was important after they had done the actual work. So the question that we asked after they had the session was, what do you think is the most useful information you learned during the instruction session? I will say this was very helpful for a new and very theoretical lesson like this. So if you do plan to do a lesson like this, I would definitely highly recommend getting some kind of assessment going with it too. So most students wrote about the usual. They like knowing where to get help. They like knowing where to go for databases. They like having a face to a name. Many of them focus specifically on the research question again activity, which is definitely great, but those comments were not usually super in depth. It was just like, I really like the research question activity. I like how it made me think about research questions, that kind of thing. A few didn't really quite get it. They thought that like if you wanted to research a minoritized population, you needed to know all the possible terminology that could be applied to that population, with kind of like an implication of like, that's really impossible. How am I going to do this? We did get to those students and tell them like, no, that was not the point of the lesson. But, you may get a few who are kind of like extremist thinking like that. Some had wanted to know how to use a database. They didn't want to get bogged down in that other stuff, which fine. But again, that was a very few of them, I would say. Many had really thoughtful, thought-provoking answers. So these are just some examples. This was anonymous feedback. So, I learned different information regarding identities and how there are things that may not impact or worry me, but can be more important to other people and vice versa. So again, just like thinking about like their identity and how they see the world versus other people's identities and how other people with different identities can see the world. I liked learning about how professors do their work, especially when they write about their research, because there was a lot I didn't know about the whole process. So this one's interesting because they care about the same stuff we care about. They care that their professors are getting fairly compensated for their work. They care that like I, as a staff member, get different benefits, different salary, etc., versus a professor versus a tenure track professor. So, they like knowing how things work and whether the people who are educating them are being treated fairly. I think the most significant thing I learned during library day is that it's important to diversify research and take into consideration how unconscious biases that we have based on our own personal background and experiences may play a role in inaccuracies in our research. So again, just like they understood the assignment. They got that, you know, even if it's an unconscious bias, it could potentially affect the work that you're doing in your college degree, in your college experience. A couple of more thought-provoking ones. The most useful information I learned was about the politics behind research and how some people do not succeed academically in their fields because of who they are or their status. So this one I thought was interesting because I obviously didn't really talk about politics. I didn't talk about like certain politicians. I didn't talk about like, you know, things that are going on in Florida is like the biggest example now. But I think it's interesting how they kind of took what I said and extrapolated into, well, obviously, you know, this sounds political, and obviously politics has something to do with a lot of it. And I just think it's interesting how they kind of like took what I said and extrapolated into something else. I think the idea that there can be research from a biased point of view is one of the most important things I learned. We use sources a lot as students and forget to see if they're even credible because typically we are under a time crunch. So I like this one because it's displaying like some self-reflection, like, you know, it is important no matter how rushed you are in your work to see if your work that you're using is credible, to see like where it's coming from, to see if it's biased or making assumptions. So I like this one because it's, you know, just showing some self-reflection that you would not maybe necessarily expect from a first year. And then, of course, the titular quote, "Scholars are not paid at all for their work and are expected to do all their research for free." I was pretty appalled by this, especially considering some don't get compensation from their university yet are still expected to stay up to date. So again, slightly simplifying, but I just think it's interesting that they were like using such strong language, for instance, appalled. And again, this is coming from the discussion from their professor where they were talking about, you know, maybe they aren't tenure track, maybe they aren't full year contract even, but they are still expected to stay up to date with the scholarship in their field. So what can we glean from this? Students are not stupid, but, you know, we should already know this. They're not stupid. They understand what is a actually pretty complicated topic. And they also care about the same things we care about. So like I said, they care that we're getting fairly compensated for our work. They care that the people who are educating them, you know, can make a living wage. They care that, you know, people can get published when and if they want, that kind of thing. Many responses had to do with the social aspect. So like I said, students, you know, are very social. A lot of what they picked up on was the identity aspect, how they relate to others, how others relate to them, you know, based on identities, based on things about them. And again, like how that affects the research that they're doing. And a lot of this also had to do with the faculty member that I was working with. So, you know, we all know what a difference a professor can make. Many of the most thoughtful responses came from students whose professor was like most open with them, most involved in social justice, most talked about how language affects the world. I actually audited this professor's course this past semester as a part of another project that we're doing with ENGL 1001. And it was definitely interesting to see how open about their identity they are and how they really, again, talk about how language affects the world. This is actually a quote from that professor. "When you make a rhetorical choice, you're also making an ethical choice." So this lesson really goes along with, you know, how they teach their course and their final assignment. Their final assignment is to make a zine, which is kind of social justice oriented, but also revolves around an interest of theirs. So again, like talking about identity and stuff like that is very much in line with what they do in their course. So where do we go from here? Like I said before, I am going to be revising the lesson. You saw it's too wordy. I definitely should have used a different font. Open access discussion, I think, is maybe slightly too much. I think I'm going to simplify that a little bit. And like I said, I am removing the identity wheel. So I am still going to show it and tell them where to find one if they want to fill it out. But there are just too many privacy concerns. So I did talk to each professor before the class to ask, like, do you think they'll be comfortable filling this out? Do you think it'll be fine? I definitely, like, during the lesson gave them, an out, like, if you want to go somewhere else to fill this out, if you just want to not fill it out, that's fine. But there are just too many privacy concerns. I don't want to accidentally out somebody. And also, when I've presented about this before, somebody mentioned, if you are part of a minoritized population, you're already very aware of how that, affects the way you come to the world and how the world comes to you, basically. So it's very redundant in many cases, although I would still say it's a very good reflective tool because, even if you are part of a minoritized population, that doesn't mean you're not necessarily like prone to unconscious biases just for other minoritized populations. But anyway, it's just too much. I couldn't figure out a way to put it online for them to do it beforehand or anything like that. And removing it paves the way for a better activity, which is more in tune with what they do in the rest of their course, which is a ton of writing activities. So I think I'm going to have them just write down everything you can about who you are as a person or something like that. So that will hopefully lead into, again, the kind of like social identity aspect. I'll figure that out when I'll cross the bridge when I come to it. And the lesson can be easily adapted if you want to other disciplines. I think that can be pretty easy. And if you just provide more discipline specific examples, this is just an example that I thought of while putting this presentation together. A biology class could talk about how a lot of the medical research out there doesn't study diverse enough populations. So now you're getting situations where, like, we're only just now discovering that medications can affect people differently depending on their race, for example. So that's just a discipline specific example of like how, again, like assumptions and biases can affect the research that you do. What have I gained from this? What have other librarians gained from this? The identity wheel, like I said, is actually a great self-reflective tool. I'm still thinking about mine. Again, I had already known that we're underestimating students, but this really underscored it for me. They are much smarter than many people give them credit for. And, this is really fairly complicated stuff, and they really do understand it. And they really do understand, like, how money affects things, basically. I gained a newfound appreciation for more theoretical teaching. That goes along with don't underestimate students. We think that, they're not going to be as interested in theoretical stuff or as engaged or whatever, but I enjoyed this, and other librarians who got to teach it enjoyed it, and other librarians who got to see it enjoyed it. And we're all just kind of tired of, the usual go here, click here, put your search terms here. And I think that this kind of thing is helpful to make you appreciate teaching more now. And faculty have been very appreciative of the lesson. And it is really nice to show faculty that we have expertise about what students should know that's outside the scope of their courses, their assignments. Our keynote speaker was talking about how, like, academic librarians are seen as, like, reactionary. We're only reacting to somebody's course, somebody's assignment. We're only reacting and, like, designing a lesson around what they want their students to know. This is really more, I think, your students should be more cognizant of the language that they are using, of critical thinking about their topic. So how could you do something similar? This is kind of the slide that's like more like, I think I might have problems introducing a DEIB centric lesson. What do I do about that? And then the next slide is going to be more practical. But so I am very lucky in that I didn't feel I needed to ask anybody for permission. I have very supportive, supervisor, dean, etc. If that is not the case in your library, I would say at least have a basic outline ready. A full artifact would be good, just stuff written out and planned out, and just try to address like anything that you think might come up beforehand. Have some ideas about how it relates to current curriculum, specific lessons, assignments. That's obviously probably something you do anyway when you're proposing new lessons, but I would say just try to do it even more so. If your library or other larger governing body has a strategic plan or a mission statement or whatever that is relevant that you could tie the lesson to, definitely do that. My library has a strategic plan with a DEIB goal, and I and another librarian co-chair the library DEIB committee. So it's, just nice to think about how I have those things as backup if anyone has a problem with the lesson. If you think people will have an issue, again, with more DEIB oriented content, you could gear it more toward language and students' use of language, and just have a bunch of DEIB centric examples, because of course DEIB is where a lot of those examples come from anyway, because that is where you find a lot of problematic language, a lot of language is making an assumption, a lot of biased language. Cite everything so you have proof. And many faculty, like, at least in this area of the country, really across the country, of course, but some areas of the country are more under attack than others. Many faculty are currently happy to have more DEIB related options, and they can be allies. More practically, you can feel free to gain inspiration from my lesson and or slides. You could even just use my slides if you want. Like I said, I'm going to link to them. I think I have it set so you can download them if you want them. Attribution would be nice. And I would really like to know what you do with it. Just if you, use the slides or use the lesson and you adapt anything, or you come up with something that like you think would make it super duper much better, please tell me, because we can always improve. Definitely learn from my mistakes. Check out the new slides. I put my under construction new slides with all the changes that I'm going to make, again, linked on the next slide. Again, more theoretical teaching tends to have like less visual stuff that you can fall back on. So I would say it benefits from having an artifact, slides, handouts, etc. Like I know when I'm teaching just like how to use a database, I just show them the database. I don't need slides for that, but definitely more theoretical stuff benefits from having something for them to look at. And again, although students are not stupid, you should still keep it simple. So like you said before, or like I said before, like you saw before, my slides were way too textually overwhelming. I just wasn't thinking when I put the slides together, and that's my bad. Keep it simple, keep the words down a little bit, and I am going to fix that in my next iteration. Also, group activities, I think, are helpful. Like I said, students, again, very social. So I think they like being able to get together in a group, discuss what they're talking about. The research question activity that they have, I have them do at the end of the lesson is a group activity. It's by table, and they seem to really like being able to discuss. And so I think that is helpful. So any questions? I do have a QR code that you can scan that will take you to the links of everything that I used today, all the lessons, etc. And there's also this bit.ly, which will take you to that too. And I also have some contact info here if you want to tell me, if you use a lesson or anything like that. So, and feel free to email me with questions after this. But if you have any questions now, I can answer them.